Guys, so I am a part of a group of young adult Christians that meet up every week or so, and what keeps coming up is this concept of fearing God. We kind of hear it over and over again in a lot of the different scriptures. It's like, make sure that you fear God. Fear God, do this, do that, and multiple people are coming up to me and they're like, you know, what does that mean? That's a topic of conversation that we have. We're like, what does it mean to fear God? Does that mean that you're like afraid of God? What does that look like? And I was having this conversation with a really good friend of mine today after the gym, and we were just talking about it. And I was like, we kind of came to this idea that, this fear for God isn't this trembling, afraid, like shaking fear of God, but it's more of like a reverence and a respect, like you'd have for a parent. God's often described as the Father. Jesus describes him as the Father. So we can kind of think of it like that, the way that you, want to do things for your dad or your father isn't because you're afraid of him, but it's because you love him and you respect him. And I think that's such a good way to frame it and look at it, but also the concept of just how all powerful and holy he is. I think of the story of Job. You look at Job 38, where God kind of pulls Job aside and has a little chit chat with him. And he's like, Job, like, where were you when I like scooped out the oceans? Where were you when I created like the mountains, like pulled the Himalayas out of the earth, like all these kind of things. He's like, where were you when I created all this stuff? He's like, where were you when created the double helix and put all this code into it that like humans and computers still can't even fully understand? You know, all of these complex things. He's like, oh, would you like to try to create them? Where were you when, like, he's kind of like showing us that our minds, I've heard it described this way, are really like a Coke can. And if God's like the size of the ocean, it's just not going to fit at all the times. And we're kind of programmed as humans. We're so like, we want to know everything, but with God, I feel like it's impossible to fully understand that or even like get a percentage of what he really is and his all like powerful, you know, presence and just what he can do. And I think that's what that fear concept is like, dang, like, one, we respect and love him, but two, it's also like he created everything. He is the creator. Like, he created you and me. And so it's like things that we can't even comprehend.